Welcome to this month's FANAC Fan History Zoom session. This is Edie Stern. I'm the FANAC webmaster. And today we have a discussion with Robin Johnson, the traveling fan from Oz. With us today are Robin, past Worldcon chair and accomplished fan from Down Under, Perry Middlemiss, who will do the majority of the interviewing, and back in the ether, but occasionally making himself known, will be Leigh Edmonds. So, Perry, an accomplished fan from Down Under in your own right, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Welcome to another of the FANAC Fan History Zoom sessions, this time coming from Australia. Today we're going to be interviewing that possibly best known Australian fan and well and truly one of the best loved Australian fans, Robin Johnson. Hello, Robin.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Everyone. Good day to everyone.
Today we're going to be basically delving into Robin's history, leading all the way back to when he started and all the way right up past the first Aussiecon in 1975. Now, I have to point out before we get started here that Aussiecon was the first science fiction convention I ever went to, and I can date my fannish history basically coming from that period. So everything that I have done since then is all Robin Johnson's fault, and that if you want to blame anybody, blame him. I'm just here tagging along. Anyway, Robin, it's good to see you again. You're looking very well. I saw you in Glasgow and you were motoring around very quickly on your little Moby, doing a great job.
I have a few complaints about that, yes.
Well, yes, I suppose you probably did. Hopefully you were under the zero alcohol limit that Scotland likes to enforce. But it seemed like you were having a good time. But we have to work out how you actually got there. So how about we go right back to the very beginning, not back as far as the Big Bang, but we'll move forward just a little bit up into the 20th century and work out, where were you born and where did you come from?
I was born in Hobart, Tasmania. My father was well, he was not an Australian by passport, but both his parents were Australian, who had got trapped basically by the First War in Britain. And so my father and his siblings grew up in Britain, as did I, because he was the family were only in Australia, in Tasmania, for a few years prior to the war, which I think was because my grandfather pulled a few strings here in Australia and got him appointed as ADC, aide-de-camp, to the governor of Tasmania, who was, of course, in those days a Brit. So my father, having just married my British mother in England, came out to Australia in 1937. No, in 36, because I was born in 37. And went back to Britain with me as a 2-year-old just before the war broke out. Several of my relatives also seem to have done the same thing. The story goes that my uncle, who was a lawyer in Sydney, was asked for his advice. Said, "Oh, I think all that silly business about that man in Berlin is over. It's perfectly safe to go now." So I have various Australian relatives who basically lived in England for much time, and there's not much of the family left here now. Anyway, I grew up in England, and when I started going to work, I worked for an airline, and I can recommend it as a good way of getting around the world later in life. Being a retired airline person. Unfortunately, my retiree benefits have now expired, so I do pay for my tickets. But this was not so for many years. And I first came out to Australia to visit one of my few remaining relatives here in 1960. And
Had you made contact with science fiction by that time? Had you started reading?
I was thinking about this. I think not. I think um, a rather limited amount. I'd been reading science fiction magazines since I discovered them. And in those days, this is sometime in the 50s, Britain, rather like Australia, was suffering from not being allowed to import American magazines. So there were British editions. And I remember thinking that the astounding Sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, somebody's got hasn't got their microphone muted. No, that's all right. So you were reading the
British edition, the sort of cut down versions. And when I first went to America, when my father was appointed to the MC in Washington, I was picking up current magazines and realized that what I'd been reading was not severely edited, and edited, I think, for size. They would take out at least one story out of everything, and it was usually the best one. I found out when I got the originals. So I'd started collecting the magazines in America. And I discovered Stephen's Book Service, which is, I think, on Staten Island. I'm not sure, but not that I spent any time there. I must have been referred to him by someone. And so I started collecting science fiction magazines in America, even while I was still living in England. But I was still at school in England, and let's see, I left in 1955. The time in America was actually, it started in 55, so about the time I was leaving school. Um, I'd I was referred to a business in London called Fantasy Book Centre, I think it was. And I'm trying desperately to remember the name of the bloke who ran it. But he ran a lending library. This is a time when there weren't very many hardcovers. And so the only hardcovers I'd seen were the few that came out from a little-known publisher called Grayson in England. And I suppose my collection started when I got in trouble for not returning his books on time. The collection is now rather larger, which brings up the problem that all of us. Perry, I can see your mouth move, but I can't hear you. Perry's still muted. I'll just
okay. Now we're right. Hopefully now we're right. So did you get in contact with other science fiction fans at the time? Other science fiction readers?
I must have, at some point, I found out there was an Easter convention in Britain, and I went to one in Yarmouth. I forget which year it was, but I know John Brunner was there because he kicked me out of his party. But it was Yarmouth was an East Coast sort of cross between a ferry port and a resort, and it was over Easter, and that was where they had the Teddy Boy riots that year. So it was we felt very contemporary. I've only been to a few British Easter cons because I left Britain in 1968 to move permanently to Australia. Much of the 60s, I was traveling back and forth on my cheap travel deal to Australia or to the States. I had relatives in Boston, and I visited them quite often. And I don't remember having any contacts in Boston at that time. But the first American Worldcon I went to was in 1967, the Nikon. Um,
So that
I
was
had
before. So that was before you came to Australia.
that was before I came to Australia, and that was what got me interested. I'd been to the London Worldcon sometime before, so I must have been sufficiently interested to worship at the feet of John Campbell, who was, I think, guest of honor. Certainly, he was present at the first London convention. We acolytes sort of crouched around his feet um, while he smoked and pontificated.
So you were
I
going to a
also
few.
met Arthur C. Clarke about that time.
So you're going to a few conventions in the UK and also in North America,
Well,
and
that
then you
that
just
was the first one, the Nikon.
yeah, and then you decided to move to Australia in 1968. Is there a
Yes.
particular reason why you did that?
Well, I'd been going back and forth, and at one of those things, I discovered um, Merv Binns, who was then working for what was the name of the shop?
McGill's.
McGill's in Melbourne. And I explained I was just passing through Melbourne. I had another relative who lived there. And he said, well, when you're back in Sydney, contact Ron Clarke. So I did. And Ron, this must have been 66 or 67, took me to a meeting of one of the Sydney groups then. I didn't realize there were all these feuds going on between the different groups. But I remember going to this uh, meeting in someone's home, and there would have been about 20 people, I suppose. So it was a social get together and chat about what was new, as I suppose most science fiction club meetings are.
And
But
so you're in
so
contact
I
with
had a
Australian
few
fandom?
contacts.
Yeah, okay.
I had a few contacts by the time I actually moved. What I took me a bit of time to realize was that apart from a few work colleagues, all the people I knew were fans in Australia. So my social life was basically fandom. From which year was the Murrumbina convention, Leigh?
Oh, 60.
Might have been
60,
1970.
69.
69. 60. I went to an Australian convention in 69 and got enthused. And I think there is a picture of the committee that formed shortly after that to hold a convention in Sydney.
Yeah, show a picture.
There's a picture of half a dozen of us.
So you'd gone to a convention in Melbourne. Where were you? Did you move to Melbourne when you first came to Australia? Or Sydney?
I lived in Sydney for a year or a bit more, and I moved down to Melbourne sometime in 1970. Um, I was a computer programmer at the time, and I tried to get a job with an airline when I arrived in Australia, and it took some time before that happened. And one of the then existing Australian airlines took me on, flew me down to Melbourne, back again to sort of pack up my flat, and back to Melbourne. So this is early 1970. And I shared a flat with John Bangsund for a period. That was why I lost the job with the airline, actually, because living with John Bangsund is a very difficult job, as several women have found. And
His
he's,
lifestyle.
well, let me say, his meals take about 3 hours, talking most of the time. And the talking doesn't stop at the end of the meal. So I was not going to bed till 3 in the morning. And as a result, was fairly obviously not very with it at work. So my job with Trans-Australian Airlines didn't last very long. I shortly got another job with an insurance company that needed a computer programmer, and that lasted until Aussiecon in 75.
So we're in.
I just asked Robin to go back and talk about the beginnings of the idea of Australia in 75 at SynCon and at HighCon.
Yes, I didn't mention that I also went to a Worldcon in Germany, HighCon in 1970, and at least one other, actually 2 other Australian fans intended to. But long years before, this idea of an Australian Worldcon had popped up. I remember seeing an ad in an early ASFR, John Bangsund's magazine. And so it was a topic of discussion, but it was all rather arbitrary. And nobody, I don't think anyone living in Australia at the time had been to a Worldcon.
No.
When I moved over in beginning of 69, I had been to 2 Worldcons, one in Britain, one in the States. And I was quite enthusiastic. And one of my reasons for joining the group that planned to run SynCon 70, the convention in that year in Sydney, was because I wanted to get something moving on this idea. And at SynCon, which was a 2-day convention, not in a hotel, it was in a scout hut. And the catering was run by my friend Peter Darling's family. So, it was one of the other people on the committee. I don't know if, Edie, if you can produce the picture. It's one of the first pictures.
Yeah,
on
first
that.
picture.
But John Ryan was a comics fan. He knew all the comics artists in Australia, and he brought this. There we are. John's the bloke on the left, sitting next to me.
Robert Johnson's the one in the check shirt with the smiley face. Directly behind him is Gary Mason,
Yeah.
who's still in fandom, living in Adelaide, and with the light blue shirt and the cup of tea is Peter Darling. Now you can probably pick out the others, but I'm not sure who the rest of them
Ron
are.
Clark is the other person in front. Behind is Gary Mason in the yellow, and John Brosnan.
John Brosnan, who ended up in the UK. Yes.
Yeah.
That's
John
right.
and Ron are also planning to attend HighCon. And they set off in an old Sydney bus, double-decker. They had it shipped to India, took it overland, and it eventually collapsed of its own weight in Greece, I believe. So they got to Europe, but not the right part. John stayed on. I think he visited Australia a few times later, but that was 1970, HighCon. So going back to SynCon in 1970, we were planning this. And I remember I sold a block of land that I had bought in Prospect when I arrived at sufficient profit to pay for my trip to Europe in 1970, because I was no longer as I was no longer working for the airline in Britain. which is now British Airways, but it was then BOAC. I was no longer working for them, but I had what they call deferred rights for when I reached retirement age. So at this stage, I'm paying for my own travel, and I I paid and bought a round the world ticket with lots of stops. And on the way, just sort of date it. My first flight in a Boeing 747 Jumbo was on that trip. And I was on the inaugural Jumbo flying from US to Australia. So that was the start of the Jumbo and I guess the mass air travel revolution as well.
So you went to HiCon in
I went to
Germany.
HiCon. I
What
met Ron
happened?
Boone.
What actually happened at the HiCon business session that made it easier for Australia to bid for the Worldcon?
Well, for one thing, we had an ad in the program book. John Foister dreamt this up, as he dreamt up practically everything in Australia. But I should have looked up the booklet to remind myself of it. But I remember it was in German. What we hadn't realized was that everything at HiCon was done in English with German, not subtitles, but summarizing or something at the end, except for John Brunner's guest of honor speech, which being John Brunner, he gave in both languages. I don't know how good his German was. It was a lot better than mine, but I think it was not that terrific German. Anyway, the business session I have absolutely no memory of, and I stupidly haven't looked up to see what rules changed, if any.
Just to change the rotation system so that Australia could bid in 75.
Right. I hadn't appreciated that.
Yeah.
I can't remember whether it was a 2-year or 3-year rotation system at the time. But it sort of put us on the agenda, I guess.
Well, I guess in 1970, with HiCon being the first Worldcon in Europe, at that stage we basically
Outside the
only had,
Anglosphere.
basically we only had let's see, we'd had US, Canada, the UK, and then Germany, and that was it at that point.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that allowed Australia to be able to bid. And so you'd already started thinking about a Worldcon in Australia. Had you chosen a year at that point?
I think in 1970 not. I think it evolved over the well, going back to SynCon, what we set up a group to exchange fanzines about that particular topic. With the I should go back and say SynCon was in January over the New Year holiday, actually. And the regular national convention at Easter was going to be in Melbourne again. And the aim of this group we set up at SynCon was to produce a proposal at the Melbourne Convention, which we did, which is when I suppose it became formal, at least at the Australian end, that we
So
were.
who else was involved in Australia at that point, exchanging these fanzines and was going to put
Leigh
forward the
Edmonds,
proposal?
Leigh Harding,
Oyster, Mason, and 2 or 3 people who are no longer around.
yeah. It wasn't a big group, but we came up with something to put to the Melbourne Convention. And it was, what's the word? The sort of a more formal committee was set up at the Melbourne Convention to progress the bid.
So did they actually build or appoint a specific bidding committee at that time?
I don't remember. I'd have to look up.
It floated around for a couple of
Lee's
years.
much more an expert on this than I am.
I've been reading it.
Okay, so were you head of the bidding, shall we say? That's what I'm trying to allude to.
Definitely not. I
You
would have
were,
said
you were, you
Forster
were.
was.
Oh, okay. So Forster was mainly part of. Yep.
The next
Okay.
bit of history relates to John Forster. Forster was, should we say, opposed to the Vietnam War. And somewhere about that time, the Americans either bombed or laid mines in Haiphong Harbor.
Mm.
And he resigned from any contact with Americans at the time, so he said. And he pulled out. The connection is, I think, only in John's mind.
Mm.
But
He quit
Leigh became, yes, he quit various associations he was in that included people from the States, and forced someone else, in this case Leigh Edmonds, to take over.
And I'd met Velma, so I wasn't very good.
While I was living at John Bangsund's place, I found that it wasn't compatible with earning a living, so I decided to move elsewhere. And John advertised for a flatmate, and it was at that time that I met Velma Brown and her mother, who accompanied her to interview John Bangsund. And a few months later, I was sharing a flat with Leigh Edmonds, and I'm not sure when he met Velma, but that was. So I have the privilege of knowing Velma Brown before Leigh did. We moved to a flat in Moonee Ponds, and I was subsequently able to work because I wasn't kept up by conversation all night.
So you were still involved in fandom, and you still were very, very much, your social life was revolving around fandom in the early 70s in Melbourne?
Yes. Leigh can probably tell me when Space Age Books as a separate establishment was set up. I remember Merv took space in the Beehive building, I think, and then decided he needed more of a street level thing, and formed a partnership with Ron Graham, who was basically one of the backers of SynCon 70 without being on the committee. Ron was a wealthy man with an enormous library, and both art and books, and was a great supporter of Aussiecon, and traveled to several overseas Worldcons as well. The next Worldcon was 71. I've forgotten where it was, but I don't think any of our committee went there. But Bill Wright and I both went to the 72 Worldcon in Los Angeles. And by that time, John Litchen, who was living in Melbourne at the time, was an amateur filmmaker. And he made a film of Aussiefan. Leigh, you'd better explain the derivation of Aussiefan, where that started.
Aussiefan was, we put advertisements in the LA Con progress reports, drawn by Gerald someone, a comic drawer in Melbourne that we'd used through Noel Kerr. And he put in every of the progress reports a comic strip called Aussiefan. And then Paul Stevens and John Litson decided they'd make a movie, which is what you showed at LA Con.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Right.
No, I believe that it was almost shown continuously throughout the whole convention, wasn't it?
Well, there were problems with that. Bill Wright and I were sharing what they called a cabana room, which was single-story rooms around the swimming pool. And sometime during the convention, Harlan Ellison and I've absolutely forgotten who, but someone got into a joke row and decided to have a fight in the pool, and this attracted a lot of people. Some in the water, some not. And after that, they all came into our room and sat on the beds, dripping wet, which made the beds unsleepable in. And by this time, we'd been showing the film. It had shown on the film program once, and the word of mouth had gone around, and so we'd set up a projector rather stupidly in our room, and the result was, for 2 nights, well, certainly the wet night, we couldn't sleep there. And the room was permanently full of people watching films. So,
Did you have any other bidding activities at that convention? Did you run any bid
yes,
parties? Sounds like you had an impromptu one anyway, but did you run any specific ones?
no, there was nothing like the Spanish Inquisition, the sort of session of people putting up bids. I don't remember anything like that anyway. But I'd also, as well as taking over the film, I'd taken over a whole lot of matchboxes. I don't know whether people in the States still use matchbooks, but a matchbox, an actual drawer you could pull out and a striking surface on the side, was a novelty. And I should have produced some for this, but I didn't think of it. They were quite popular. I gave hundreds of those out. We also had a T-shirt. I remember holding a bundle of T-shirts in an elevator, and Harlan got in and said, "Do you have any in my size, Harlan?" He said to me, "Do you have any in my size?" And I rather stupidly said, "Not in your size, Harlan, no." I
So
don't know whether I spoke to him ever again. I must have, because he was a guest at a convention over here subsequently.
So you were doing a lot of
So I was
schmoozing, I
promoting.
guess.
We didn't have a
Yeah.
table or anything.
Okay, so it was mostly promotion. What else was going on around the time that you were doing to help foster relations between the US and Australia or Australian fandom?
Well, uh, I was traveling a lot on that 72 trip. I visited Cincinnati and um, I don't think it was for a convention, but by this time the Simsies were friends of mine, and Roger and Pat both now gone, sadly. They had been mainstays of Midwestcon for years, and I did get to one or two later on.
1972 was also the start of the Down Under Fan Fund, Duff, with Leslie Luttrell coming out to Australia. Were you involved in the organisation of Duff in any way?
I think I helped on the travel side. Um, I didn't become officially a travel agent until, oh, I don't know, about 1980, but I already had contacts. And um, I don't think I made the bookings, but I may have made suggestions.
Okay,
Um,
but
we
that was
we
happening at the time, yeah.
we had done a deal of sorts with Air New Zealand, um, mainly because uh, the companies that ran flights between Australia and America were um, Pan American, which existed then, and Qantas, and neither of those were remotely interested. But Air New Zealand had just started running flights through from Sydney through New Zealand to the States, and that was quite a good. They were very competitive, and they carried freight for us at various times. Just carried posters and distributed leaflets and things.
Well, let's go back a little bit because we seem to be getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves here, which I can understand. So let's go back. We're back in 72. You've been to the convention in the US, in LA, to promote Aussiecon. The Antifan film is now floating around the US and is going to spend the rest of its life doing something around there, being shown at conventions all over the place. So what happens after that?
Well, I should going back to the movie. There were actually 2 copies in the States. The film was originally made silent, and at the last minute, Ron Graham financed the addition of sound. And the copy I took over under my arm on the plane was the sound one. The silent one had been sent over by air freight earlier, and then somehow got caught up in customs and wasn't released until after Aussiecon.
Okay.
And that I'm not sure who got which copy, but there were at least 2 copies floating around in America with people that were visiting a lot of cons and showing it at a lot of cons. And Jack Chalker, who was then not known as an author, but as a bibliographer who sold his stuff at conventions and so traveled to a lot of regional conventions, was a brilliant person to carry it around and promote it. I can't remember who the other person was, but it certainly got a lot of exposure. This is in the period, really only a year between the 72 Worldcon and the 73 Worldcon in Toronto, where Australia in 75 won its bid. There had been some slight opposition, but it faded away by the time Toronto came round. But meanwhile, the film had been shown at 20 or 30 regional conventions. And so quite a lot of people who weren't at LACon had seen it. And,
so when did you become chair of the organising committee for Aussiecon? Was that pre or post Toronto?
We're in between.
Yeah, well, after I refused, I did turn up to meetings because I was holding Velma's hand.
You had other interests, Leigh. Yes,
Yes,
obviously.
he was holding Velma's hand rather too long, I think.
Yeah.
So
I don't think it was a pooch. I think it was forced on us.
Yeah.
But,
so
by this
Toronto.
time, which convention did Leslie come to?
72, the SynCon 72.
Right.
That was boss by then.
That was well, by that time there were some people in Sydney that seemed to want to run conventions other than me.
Mm.
I wasn't living in Sydney anymore, so I wasn't involved. But there was a brief period when there were Sydney conventions, sort of early 70s to early 80s, I suppose.
So the 1970s Sydney conventions were running. There were running conventions in Melbourne. You had been to LA. The Antifan film was moving around the US, and you were heading towards Toronto, where the site selection was going to be held. Were you chair at that?
Bruce Gillespie was the person who went to Toronto.
Right. Did you go to Toronto?
I didn't know. As far as I remember, Bruce is the only Australian there. Might have been Ron Graham.
I think Merv was there.
But yes, Merv Binns had got sufficiently financial to travel a bit too, and he went to several Worldcons about this time.
Right.
I found a lovely picture of him in costume, which I think was at the Brighton convention a bit later too.
That was 79. Yeah.
Yeah.
So so Bruce Gillespie, Merv Binns were there in Toronto. Had you been appointed chair of the committee by this point?
I think I probably was by then. Yeah.
Probably by
Yeah.
72.
Actually, well, I'm getting confused because I went to the 1973 convention in Washington, 74 convention in
Yeah, we were
Washington.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ursula Le Guin won a Hugo, but she wasn't present. And I was delegated to ring her to tell her she'd won. In those days, long distance phone calls in America were not particularly cheap. I was on the phone to her for over 2 hours because the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, Robin, look, we had, of course, selected her in order to announce our guest of honor at Toronto the year before. And in 1974, her husband, who was an academic, had decided to take a year off, and they were going to some point in Europe. And she decided she could no longer manage to come to the Worldcon. So sort of spontaneously online, as you would say now, I had to try and convince her not to change her mind. And because she told me on that phone call, and I can remember going into a sort of panic that involves talking to someone for 2 hours to try and talk them out of their plans.
So you'd already decided on Le Guin. Had you
We
decided on
decided on her before the Toronto thing, and she'd accepted.
Writers' workshop.
Yes, one of her conditions, I can't remember whether it was right from the start or in the process of re-persuading her, was that she would run a writers' workshop. And Bruce managed to organize funding through the Australia Council, which for non-Australians is a sort of partly government-financed cultural mob that supports financially people doing things in that sphere. And we got a grant. Bruce's committee, got a grant to hold that. And that was for a week or so. I can't remember if it was before or after. Before the convention. In Mossman, I think it was a Sydney suburb on one.
No, in Dandenongs.
Oh,
Dandenong Hills outside Melbourne. Yeah.
But that was the clincher for her, I think. And her husband and at least one child came with her. So,
had you decided early on who the fan guests of honor were going to be?
yes, this was at the time when Mike
Glicksohn.
Mike Glicksohn was still married to
Susan Wood.
So they were selected as a married couple, but came as a separated non-couple.
Right.
And they both fan guests of honor. I'm not sure when. I'm trying to remember the financial arrangements, but I remember we got a partial fare for her out of Air New Zealand because I managed to find a travel agent in America to organize a group fare, which was quite a bit cheaper than individual fares, and as a concomitant to that, you got, I think, 1.5, possibly 2 free tickets. And half of them, anyway, Mike and Sue each got a half fare concession on that. I don't know whether we refunded the other half, but that was the advantage to us of having a group. It sort of ease the costs a little.
So how was it for you, the difference between bidding for a Worldcon and then suddenly after Toronto realizing that you've got 2 years to organise something that you've never organised before?
I spent most of the time finding other people to delegate things to.
Good move. Good move.
Robin, talk about De Graves and the Magic Pudding Club.
Yes, the big regular sort of social meeting point in Sydney at the time,
Melbourne.
were in Melbourne, was a place called De Graves Tavern, which no longer exists, but it was a really very poor restaurant with a rotten wine list, but it was cheap and it was central. It was near the main train station then in Melbourne. And this became the regular weekly meeting point. And one might have gone on to do something else, but people met there. The equivalent in Sydney was the Galaxy Bookshop, which was run by Shane McCormack, who's one of the most active fans in Sydney. But there was also a sort of residential thing. I was part of initially. It became known as the Magic Pudding Club. For anyone who didn't grow up with Australian kids' books, the Magic Pudding was every Australian kid was brought up on.
You took slices out of it, and it just
it never ran out.
It was a fantastical story about a magic pudding written by Norman Lindsay, and when you took a slice of the pudding just kept on recreating itself, so it never disappeared. It was sort of an infinite pudding.
And the flat, the apartment, actually was it was a bungalow, a single-story building in Carlton, which is a close-in suburb, very near Melbourne University. And at various times, probably a dozen fans were there for part of its existence. I remember being there, and we had a flagpole. One of the differences that always struck me in America was lots of people have flagpoles. It was quite uncommon in Australia, but we had a flagpole, and someone, I don't know who, managed to hang the flag upside down at one point. And we were raided by the police for being, I don't know, disrespectful or something. It was lucky that was what they were raiding us for, because I'm sure there were substances.
Yeah, well, let's not go into that, just in case there's statutes of limitations floating around. We better not. So were you, the De Graves Tavern and the Magic Pudding Club were active areas for your recruitment?
I'm sorry.
Were they active areas for your recruitment for the committee?
Yes. One of Merv's things, even before he had his own business, was printing little flyers and sticking them in the pages of books on sale at McGill's bookshop. Of course, when he opened Space Age Books, or not everything, but most of the books were science fiction or related, and so it was its own advertisement. But Merv was a great propagandist, and you could buy fanzines there as well, I remember. I don't remember if he sold second-hand fanzines, which is what Stephen's Book Service did in New York. I'm now wondering, there was another bookshop in New York, in Lower Manhattan, sort of the Battery area. I've forgotten whether that was Stephen's or not. I know he lived on Staten Island. And for years, that was the source of my fanzine collection. Unfortunately, now my fanzine collection is sort of post an era at which the garage got flooded.
Okay. Yes.
Lots of people have had these disasters, and I had one early on. I don't think I moved all of them to Australia because I'd already. I remember before moving to Australia, I sold quite a lot of fanzines to British fans.
Okay. So
However,
you're moving. So we're moving towards Aussiecon in August 1975. How was what was your state of mind like as you were helping to organise this?
panic.
Oh, that's a feeling I can quite well remember.
Yes, you were stupid enough to do it twice, then.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Um,
I still can't work that
so
out either.
leading up to 1975, actually, going back to the film for a second, there's a scene in the film about the choice of hotels, and this was when I lost my hair, or at least my toupee. I was already bald as a coot by the time I moved to Australia, and but I was wearing a toupee for the first few years, and in the film we're inspecting the site of what is now one of the Hiltons in Melbourne, which was competing with the Southern Cross, which is the name of the hotel where it was actually held. And Antifan from across the street casts a fishing hook, catches my toupee, and it is zipped off. And I die out of embarrassment or something. So the choice became the Southern Cross, and it wasn't a bad choice actually. The management was surprisingly cooperative. They wanted conventions. I don't think until we actually happened, they realized how disruptive science fiction conventions are for things like the queue for the elevators. Story about that. My first American Worldcon, Nikon, was in a hotel right opposite the main train station in New York. And it was a very large hotel. And the convention space was split between Nikon and a Dianetics convention. And in those days, I think the science fiction crowd wasn't quite as antipathetic to Dianetics as it seems to be now. And there was some overlap. But there were some people also in the hotel, mostly airline crews, who were extremely upset at having to wait half an hour to get a lift to the 23rd floor or whatever it was. So my early impression of Worldcons included queues for the elevator.
So we've spoken a bit about the writers' workshop that Le Guin ran in the week leading up to or preceding the convention. One of the other major function areas that you dealt with at Aussiecon was the art show. Do you have any stories to tell us about art show problems or customs?
We had a thought about the art show. We decided we'd open it or publicize it in schools, and I wasn't particularly involved with the details of this because I delegated them to, I think, John Breeden.
Yeah, John.
And we booked the town hall's exhibition space, which is much larger than the hotels, and we filled it. It was mostly pretty mediocre, but at least we were spreading the net wide. And the idea was we would select the best of from that to come to the art show. Meanwhile, we also organized for Fred Patton in Los Angeles to collect together a whole lot of people by well-known science fiction artists in the States to come over to Australia, not so much for sale as for exhibition. And Air New Zealand decided they would carry, I suppose, a couple of tea chests full, so maybe 30 pictures. And this, well, a few days before the convention, the American group arrived in Sydney. I flew up to meet them and flew down a couple of days before the convention back to Melbourne to be met by a panicked person saying, look, the art show stuff has arrived and it's held up in customs. I went over to the customs shed, was talking to the customs officers, and it turned out they had some sort of rule about paying customs duty on things, even if they weren't for sale. And it went on what the people valued them at. And unfortunately, some people had valued them rather high. And so suddenly we got a bill which was in the 5-figure area for the deposit to pay to customs. Well, of course, we didn't have the money. And that took a bit of negotiation, I can tell you. Eventually, we found a customs officer who was not on the shift at that time. I had to wait till he came on, who was a fan, who could be persuaded. I had a list of what was in which tea chest. And I was able to open it and show that something that was listed as being worth 10,000 or something was, while it was quite nice, was probably worth a couple of hundred.
So you got out of that one?
Well, there was an exemption for whatever the exemption figure was below that. But that involved a lot of time of mine just before the convention.
Just at the time when you don't want it to.
Absolutely. And that's a thing I learned. There is always something unexpected going to come up that's going to disrupt anything.